I think I shall begin by saying just one thing about John Keats. There is such a lot to be said about Keats, but I shall say just one thing. Towards the end of his life, John Keats said, I think I shall be among the English poets after my death. I repeat, I think I shall be among the English poets after my death. Matthew Arnold quotes this sentence in his essay on John Keats towards the end of his essay and says that Keats humbly desired to be among the English poets, humbly hoped to be among the English poets after his death. And Matthew Arnold remarks, I quote, he is, he is with Shakespeare. He is, he is with Shakespeare. He is not merely with the English poets. He is not merely among the English poets. He is with Shakespeare. The context in which the poem came to be written is very interesting. It was written in 1819, in the summer of 1819. It was written in London. It was written either in the garden of the historic pub, the Spaniards Inn, in Hampstead, London, or in the garden of Keats's friend's house. And Keats's friend was Charles Brown. The house was actually shared by Keats and Brown, Keats and Charles Brown. The house at Wentworth Place, also in Hampstead, London. A nightingale had built a nest on a plum tree, according to Charles Brown. According to Charles Brown, it was written in the garden of his house, Wentworth Place, in Hampstead, London. A nightingale had built a nest on a plum tree, and Keats was fascinated by the bird and its song. And one morning he took a dining chair and placed it in the shade of the tree and spent some time there. And when he returned to the house from the garden, the poem, at least the first draft of the poem, was complete. The poem was first published in the periodical Annals of the Fine Arts and is looked upon as one of the finest specimens of the poetry of John Keats. Let us take a close look at the title of the poem, Ode to a Nightingale. Ode. In ancient Greek, the word ode meant song. But when we use it in English today, we have a lyric poem in mind. An ode is a lyric poem. It is addressed to somebody or something. It is elevated in content and style. It embodies the thoughts and feelings of the speaker. It has a varying meter and usually a complex stanzaic pattern. Ode to a Nightingale means an ode addressed to a nightingale. Ode to a Nightingale. The nightingale is one of the most illustrious birds in Western ornithology. It is not an impressive bird to look at. It's a plain brown bird with a reddish tail, but its song is magical, simultaneously sweet and sorrowful. It is called the nightingale because, unlike most other birds, it sings during the night as well. No other bird, not even the skylark, has been immortalized so much in Western literature as the nightingale. The first Nightingale in Western literature is found in Homer. Practically every major writer after Homer has spoken of the nightingale. Ovid, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Keats, of course, Keats, and T.S. Eliot, to give random examples. Let us take one more look at the title of the poem, Ode to a Nightingale. Ode to a Nightingale, not Ode to the Nightingale. The indefinite article is used. The determiner that is used is a, Ode to a Nightingale. What is the conclusion that can be drawn from this? I would say that we can conclude that as far as the title of the poem is concerned, there is nothing generic about the bird. The ode is addressed to a nightingale, the specific bird which the poet saw, the specific bird whose song the poet heard. And if the poet's friend Charles Brown is to be believed, the specific bird which built a nest in the plum tree of the garden of the house of Charles Brown, which was shared by the poet, and which stands in the area which was known as John Street and which is now known as Keats' Grove in Hampstead in London. I am sure that you will point out that later in the poem, the poet speaks in general terms. That may be right. But as far as the title is concerned, it is addressed to a specific bird, the bird that the poet saw. The starting point of the poem, the starting point of the trajectory, the thematic trajectory of the poem, is the bird, the specific nightingale, which the poet saw and the poet heard. Ode to a Nightingale. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense. Let us look at the first three words of the line of the poem. My heart aches. The poet uses the present tense. The poet could very well have used the past tense. Poets frequently use the past tense. I wandered lonely as a cloud, daffodils of William Wordsworth. They less frequently use the future tense. Keats could very well have used the future tense, but poets less frequently use the future tense. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, the lake isle of Innisfree of W.B. Yeats. But here, Keats uses the present tense. As a result, the poet is able to win the empathy of the reader. As a result, a sense of immediacy is created. And what does the poet say? My heart aches. What can be more immediate to a person, more dear to a person than his own heart? My heart aches. The three words generate a powerful sense of immediacy and succeed in obtaining the empathy of the sensitive reader. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. The speaker is obviously in a state of pain, in a state of heartbreak, and he feels a drowsy numbness. Numbness is loss of feeling, loss of sensation. Drowsy is sleepy, lethargic, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense. The speaker appears to have lost all sensation, all feeling, as though of hemlock I had drunk. Hemlock is a plant which is highly poisonous and which can be used as a sedative, as an analgesic when consumed in small doses. The word hemlock immediately brings to the mind of the reader, provided he is a well informed reader, the name of Socrates. Socrates was put to death in ancient Greece by making him drink hemlock. Here the speaker feels as if he has drunk hemlock. Perhaps not a high dose of hemlock as consumed by Socrates, which would have resulted in his own death, but a small dose, a light dose of hemlock. Socrates was a great man whose greatness was not understood by the society in which he lived and who was put to death by the society in which he was cited. There is no doubt that there is a hidden allusion to Socrates in this passage. Is it possible that Keats saw himself as a great poet whose greatness was not recognized by the society in which he lived? I think I can go further. Keats was mercilessly attacked by the critics of the day, and according to some, like Lord Byron, the death of Keats was caused or at least hastened by these ruthless, merciless attacks. Whether or not this is true, it is a fact that Keats was deeply affected in a negative manner by the violent attacks on his poetry and himself by the critics of the day. I think we can interpret this passage along these lines. Socrates was a great man who was put to death by the society of ancient Greece. Keats is a great poet who is put to death by the contemporary society, the contemporary British society. The only difference is that here the death is metaphorical, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. Opiate. Opiate is a drug created from opium. Again, opium is a plant which can be used as a narcotic, which can be used as an analgesic, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains, to the last drop, to the dregs. These lines make the mood of the speaker clear. The speaker is grief-stricken, heartbroken, and he feels a sense of numbness overwhelming his entire self. It is almost as if he has drunk hemlock or drunk some opiate. 1 minute passed. Whether it is hemlock or opiate, it takes some time for the drug to have its effect on the body and the mind. What is the present state of the speaker's body, the speaker's mind? It is as if he has drunk hemlock or some opiate and 1 minute has passed. The drug has started taking its effect. And Lethe words had sunk. Lethe is the river in the underworld, the river of forgetfulness in the underworld in classical mythology. Lethe words had sunk. He has moved towards Lethe. He has become forgetful. Forgetful of what? Not any specific incident, but of practically everything. He has started forgetting practically everything about himself and the world in which he lives. Why has this happened? This situation in which the speaker finds that he has, metaphorically at least, drunk hemlock or taken some opiate, and he has started forgetting everything, that he has been overwhelmed by numbness, by lack of sensation, lack of feeling, lack of memory. Why has this happened? The rest of the stanza explains. The rest of the stanza gives the answer to this question. "'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot." We have to return to the bird which had built its nest in the plum tree, the bird which is the ultimate source of inspiration for this poem. The poet listens to the cry of the bird. It's obvious that the bird is happy, unlike the poet. And the natural reaction, the normal reaction, would have been one of envy, one of jealousy. But the speaker here clarifies that he is not envious of the happy lot, happy fate, happy situation, happy condition of the nightingale, but being too happy in thine happiness. That is it. The poet has completely lost himself in the song of the bird. The poet has allowed himself to be completely absorbed in the happiness of the bird, but being too happy in thine happiness. Too happy. Too is very, but there is always a slightly negative connotation in too. Too happy, so happy that this happiness does not belong to this world. So happy that this happiness does not belong to human beings. Too happy in thine happiness that thou, light winged, dryad of the trees, light winged, dryad of the trees. Dryad is a tree spirit. How deeply Keats has absorbed classical mythology, classical ethos, classical life, classical culture. Dryad of the trees. The poet now sees the bird not as a bird, not as a living entity, but as a spirit of the trees, a spirit that lives in the trees, light winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green. Greenery created by the leaves, beech and green. I think the best explanation is that the trees are beech trees of beech and green. A small wood has been created, a small forest has been created by the beech trees growing side by side, of beech and green, and shadows numberless. The sun is able to penetrate through the canopy of the trees only with difficulty. And when you look around, you find only shadows. You cannot count the number of shadows. The shadows are numberless, an infinite number of shadows. Singest of summer in full-throated ease. And the nightingale, which to the poet appears to be not merely a bird but a spirit, a dryad, is very happily singing. What is the bird singing of? Singing of summer. Summer, this is not India, this is not South India, this is not Kerala, this is not Tamil Nadu at all. In England, summer is a very pleasant month. Singest of summer in full-throated ease. It is seldom very hot in England in summer, but this time I think the temperatures rose to something like 40 degrees, unheard of in the recent history of the United Kingdom. But in general, compared to winter, with its darkness, with its long nights, with its snow, with its ice, with its freezing temperatures, with its bitter cold, summer is a very pleasant month, very happy month for England, for the people of England. Singest of summer in full-throated ease. That is it. It is not. It is not that the bird is singing with difficulty. The bird is not a musician. The bird is not an artist who has put in hours of years of practice in order to sing its song. Unlike human beings, musicians, unlike human musicians, the bird sings with ease, full-throated ease, without any difficulty, without any effort, without any training, without any practice. I would like to bring into conjunction with the last line of the first stanza, or the last few words of the first stanza of this poem, with a very well-known quote of John Keats. This is what Keats says in one of his letters, if I remember correctly. If poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. I repeat, if poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. So, Keats was a poet who valued spontaneity very much, who valued full-throated ease very much. And that is why here he so ardently admires the ease with which the bird sings, the nightingale sings. The nightingale creates great music, not as a result of effort, not as a result of practice, not as a result of training, but the music is nothing but a creation of full-throated ease. The song of the nightingale is the result of full-throated ease. I would like to invite you to place side by side with this stanza, with this opening stanza of the Nightingale Ode, the opening stanza of another equally famous ode, the Skylark Ode of P.B. Shelley. This is how, to a Skylark of Percy Bysshe Shelley, opens. Hail to thee, blithe spirit. Let me try to remember the lines. There was a time when I was teaching the Skylark Ode year after year, but that was long ago. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wed, that from heaven or near it pours thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. I think there is much in common between the Nightingale of Keats and the Skylark of Shelley. Keats wonders whether it's a bird or a spirit. He calls it, thou light winged dryad of the trees. It's a spirit of the trees. And Shelley calls his Skylark blithe spirit. Both the birds are extremely happy, blithe, unlike both the poets, unlike Keats and unlike Shelley, who were all beset with very serious problems and entanglements and embarrassments. The Nightingale of Keats sings with full throated ease. Similarly, the Skylark of Shelley pours out its full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Before I move to the next answer, I would like to throw some light on the personal context in which the Nightingale Ode came to be written. The poem begins with the powerful words, "My heart aches." What was behind the heartache? Why is it that the speaker feels that he is overwhelmed with pain, overwhelmed with anguish, overwhelmed with sorrow? A number of reasons can be identified, but I shall pinpoint the three most important reasons to you. First of all, John Keats was living a life of poverty and he was beset with serious financial problems. The second reason was that his work, his poetry, was mercilessly attacked by the critics. And though, of course, he knew in his heart of hearts that he was a gifted poet, even a great poet, the violent attacks of the critics shook his self belief, shook his self confidence. To top it off, the love life of John Keats had more than its share of pain. Every woman that he fell in love with, including Fanny Brown, disappointed him and proved to be a la belle dame sans mercy. I'm really delighted to read with you the second stanza, which is one of the most memorable stanzas in romantic poetry. In fact, one of the best loved stanzas in all English poetry. The drinking stanza. The stanza which celebrates without any hesitation, without any sense of shame, without any sense of guilt, drinking, the noble pastime of drinking, the noble pursuit of drinking, the noble pleasure of drinking, the noble passion of drinking. You must take care not to read the stanza in isolation because it is part of a long and rich tradition in English poetry of celebrating this noble pastime, pursuit, pleasure, passion without any hesitation. I think a very early exemplification of this great tradition, perhaps the earliest exemplification of this great tradition, is a medieval drinking song of the 15th century. After that, we have innumerable poems, at least innumerable passages where drinking is celebrated, either literally or metaphorically. And these poems, these passages include Ben Jonson's To Celia, drink to me only with thine eyes. Thomas Hardy, Thomas Hardy's drinking song. W.B. Yeats's A Drinking Song. And rather recently, Slow Gin, Slow Gin, Slow Gin of Seamus Heaney. As a schoolboy, I was surprised to learn that Emily Dickinson, even Emily Dickinson, has written a poem, a beautiful poem, a brilliant poem unabashedly celebrating the fine art of drinking. I taste a liquor never brewed. I taste a liquor never brewed, where the speaker gets drunk not with alcohol, but with life, but with nature. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. Oh is an exclamation. It can mean different things in different contexts. Here, it effectively captures the intense, passionate desire of the speaker. Oh, for a draught of vintage. Draught, what you drink at one go. A mouthful. Oh, for a mouthful. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been. Vintage, again, you have vintage cars, vintage watches. But in this context, it means the place and year of the production of the wine. And certain years are looked upon as remarkable years. For example, I think 1982 was an outstanding vintage for wine. And draft, I think I should have said it earlier, draft beer is beer from a keg or a barrel or a cask rather than from a bottle or a can. Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth. Wine becomes better and better the longer it is kept under the earth, it is buried under the earth, tasting of flora and the country green. Flora, the plants, flora and fauna. Flora is the ancient Roman goddess of plants. Here it stands for the vegetation in general. It can stand for the vegetation in general. But I think Keats took care to capitalize the initial letter of the word flora, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburned mirth. You must remember that Keats is writing these lines in England, which is cold, damp, much of the year it is dark, it snows during winter, and he's thinking of the land from where the wine comes, the vintage comes. Provence is a region in southern France, southeastern France, one of the best wine producing regions of the world. And it is definitely much more warm, much more sunny than England with its notorious winters. And in his mind's eye, the poet sees the entire world from which this wine comes, this vintage comes. And this world includes the greenery, the vegetation, the dance, the joy, the sun, all of which are crucial in giving Provence its identity. An identity which is so dramatically different from the identity of the cold, dark, damp England where the poet is now writing these lines. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, the true, the bashful hippogreen. Again, the poet uses the exclamation, oh. It captures the intense longing that the speaker feels For a beaker full of the warm south. Beaker is a cup, large cup, usually without handles. Full of the warm south. Again, it's just wine that comes from southern Europe. The southern part of Europe as opposed to the northern part is warmer. And you must remember that these lines are being written in England, in the northern part of Europe. South could also mean the south of France, from where some of the best wines of the world are produced. Full of the true, the blushful Hippocrene. Hippocrene in Greek mythology is a spring on Mount Helicon, created by the hooves of Pegasus. And the spring is sacred to the Muses, and whoever imbibes the water of the spring gets poetic inspiration. The true, the blushful, reddish Hippocrene, red-colored waters of the Hippocrene. Here, the poet seems to be deliberately confusing wine produced in the south of France and the waters of the Hippocrene, the sacred spring on Mount Helicon in Greek mythology. Thus, the poet wants to get drunk with wine and also use this wine to stimulate his poetic inspiration. That is why there is this deliberate confusion between wine and Hippocrene. The wine is red or reddish, and the poet deliberately transfers this quality of the wine, the reddish color of the wine, to the waters of the Hippocrene. And the waters of the Hippocrene are sacred to the Muses and are capable of providing poetic inspiration when imbibed. With beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple stained mouth, one cannot but marvel at the fantastic imagination of the poet. See how the bubbles are presented. The beaker is full of wine, newly poured wine, and there are bubbles at the brim of the beaker, and the bubbles are like strings of beads with beaded bubbles winking at the brim. It appears to the poet that the bubbles are winking at him, and purple stained mouth. The mouth has been stained purple. Is it the mouth of the beaker or the mouth of the speaker? I leave it to your choice. I would like to pause for a moment and invite you to compare and perhaps also contrast these very highly charged lines about drinking with the immortal exhortation to drink made by Omar Khayyam as translated by Edward Fitzgerald. I quote, "Drink, for you know not whence you came nor why. Drink, for you know not why you go nor where." Unquote. That I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim. The speaker wants to use the wine as the key to disappearing from this world. The speaker wants to leave the world unseen. Nobody should even notice the fact that he is leaving the world. And with thee fade away to the forest dim. He wants to disappear from this world, from the world as inhabited by human beings, and in a way reappear in the world, in the forest, in the world inhabited by the nightingale. There is a very interesting biography of the poet titled John Keats by Nicholas Rowe. In his book John Keats, Nicholas Rowe puts forward the contention that drinking ran in the family of Keats. It is wrong, according to Rowe, to see the drinking habit of John Keats in an isolated manner. Far from it, the drinking habit was present in almost every member of the family. According to Nicholas Rowe, the mother of the poet was a hard drinker, and she drank too much alcohol when she was pregnant with the poet. And that, according to Nicholas Rowe, is the reason for the poet developing consumption, as it was called at the time, or for the poet developing tuberculosis. The poet developing tuberculosis and ultimately giving up his life for consumption or tuberculosis. The third stanza is a logical continuation of the second stanza, an amplification on the second stanza, an explanation for what is said in the second stanza. In the second stanza, the speaker expresses his ardent desire to leave the world unseen and fade away into the forest dim and be with the nightingale. In the third stanza, he explains why he wants to do this. There is no doubt that the third stanza of the Nightingale Ode comprises some of the most poignant lines ever written in English poetry. Certainly the most poignant passage in all Keats. Why does the poet want to escape from the world in which he is positioned? Escape from the world in which he is positioned and escape to the world of the nightingale. The speaker says that he wants to forget certain things which are obviously present in the world in which he is sighted, but certain things which are not known to the nightingale. Fade far away, dissolve, quite forget what thou among the leaves hast never known. Ignorance certainly is bliss. The nightingale is ignorant of certain things which are crucially present in the world in which the speaker is sighted. The weariness, the fever, and the fret. Here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs. The weariness, the fever, and the fret. What is human life? It is nothing but feeling very weary all the time, tired, exhausted all the time. The struggle to live itself is sufficient to make us completely exhausted. The fever, the excitement, or rather the negative excitement, with which life is filled, the fret, the worry, the trouble. Here where men sit and hear each other groan. I think John Keats was at this point in his life, under treatment for consumption, tuberculosis. And this line effectively captures the atmosphere of a TB sanatorium, of a consumption clinic, Here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs. Palsy is paralysis. Paralysis usually accompanied by tremors. What do you find when you look around you? People suffering from paralysis, people growing prematurely old, losing their hair becoming grey, and their hair becoming very few in number. Where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. Young men suddenly become pale. They become thin like ghosts, and then they die. This could be an allusion to death by consumption, which was very common at the time. Several members of the family of the poet had succumbed to consumption, and ultimately the poet himself would lose his life to consumption. Where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and leaden eye despairs. That is it. You try to think, you become sorrowful, because not a single happy thought can come to you. Where to think is to be full of sorrow, and leaden eye despairs. Heavy-eyed despairs. You become full of sorrow and full of despair. And the despair is so powerful that it is almost able to shut your eyes. It makes your eyes very heavy, leaden-eyed despairs. Where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes. Beauty, how long does it last? Beauty is fleeting. Beauty is temporary. Beauty vanishes along with youth. Where beauty, it's transient, it's impermanent. Beauty cannot keep her lustrous, bright eyes. Of course, the eyes of beauty are bright, are attractive, but beauty unfortunately cannot maintain. It's beautiful, it's attractive, it's bright, it's lustrous eyes. Or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Pine is look with longing, the look of a typical lover, a look which expresses both longing and sadness. Or new love pine at them beyond tomorrow. Beauty is transient and so is love. Just as beauty vanishes in no time, love also vanishes in no time. How can one be happy in this world? How can one not suffer from despair, frustration, sorrow, grief in this world? It is precisely because of this that the speaker wants to escape from the world of human beings, from the world in which he is positioned, and go to the world of the nightingale, the forest dim. It would appear that the person who wrote these lines seems to believe that to live is to suffer. The question before us is, what made John Keats such a heartbroken man? What made John Keats equate life and suffering, life and sorrow, life and tragedy? There are a number of explanations for this. John Keats lost both his parents early. His life was a life of eternal poverty. He never got the recognition he deserved as a poet. As a poet, he never got the recognition he deserved. Instead, his poetry was brutally attacked by the critics. The death of his brother Tom, as a result of tuberculosis, which was then known as consumption, had a devastating effect on him. The migration of his brother George to America depressed him. His love life had more than its share of problems, including his entanglement with Fanny Brown, which remained precisely that, an entanglement. To top it off, his own health was failing. He was suffering from consumption, acutely from consumption, as tuberculosis was known at the time. And he knew that he did not have many more years to live. No wonder that he became extremely depressive and started equating life with suffering and sorrow. Stanza 3 of the Nightingale Ode invites comparison and perhaps also contrast with a line from Ode to the West Wind of P.B. Shelley. I quote, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed, unquote. Before I focus critical attention on the fourth stanza, I would like to point out that a systematic opposition appears to have been set up by the poet between the world of the nightingale, as captured in the second stanza, and the world of the speaker, as reflected in the third stanza. For example, the world of the nightingale is brilliantly colorful, country green, purple-stained mouth. The world of the speaker is monochromatically grey, last grey hairs. The world of the nightingale presents dance and Provençal song. It is a world full of activity and enthusiasm. In the world of the nightingale, we come across dance and Provençal song. In the world of the speaker, the men sit and hear each other groan. The contrast is between the dance and the sitting, the song and the groaning. Perhaps the most potent polar opposition that is set up is between exuberant joy in the world of the nightingale, as suggested in the second stanza, and devastating sorrow in the world of the speaker, as expressed in the third stanza. The exact words are sunburnt mirth. What more can you ask for? Sunburnt mirth. And in the third stanza, sunburnt mirth in the second stanza, and in the third stanza, sorrow, where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and despair, leadenite despairs. This is the most potent polar opposition that is established between the two worlds. The fourth stanza is a very beautiful stanza. It's an exquisite stanza. At the beginning of the fourth stanza, the speaker declares that he will not use the option of wine in order to fly to the bird, in order to leave the world in which he is positioned and go to the world of the nightingale. Instead, he will use his poetic imagination, the viewless wings of poesy. Away, away, for I will fly to thee, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of poesy. Bacchus is the Roman god of wine. Dionysus, that's how the Greeks called him. Bacchus was the god not merely of wine, but also of vegetation, of revelry, of celebration, of cultivation. And I think he is my favorite among the Roman gods. Not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, According to classical mythology, Bacchus traveled on a chariot pulled by leopards. But on the viewless wings of poesy, the viewless wings of poesy, he will use his poetic imagination to fly to the bird, to transport himself from ground level to the branch of the tree where the nightingale has perched itself. Though the dull brain perplexes and retards, the speaker accepts that this attempt is retarded by his brain. The brain is dull. The brain does not have the spirit of his poetic imagination. The brain tries to confuse him and retard him and prevent him from taking this effort. I think we can relate this line to the sort of poetry that John Keats was practicing. Highly romantic. If John Keats had not been a romantic poet and had instead been a neoclassical poet, I don't think he would have written this line, because the intellectual component, the cerebral component, is antithetical, more or less antithetical, largely antithetical to romantic poetry, but not antithetical to the sort of poetry that Dryden was writing or Pope was writing, because there the cerebral element, the intellectual element is very strong. I tell my students, romantic poetry comes from the heart. Neoclassical poetry, Augustan poetry, comes from the head. Already with thee, tender is the night. He has just said that. That is the greatness of poetry. That is the greatness of the poetic imagination. He is already with thee. The thought that he should fly to the bird is sufficient for his very powerful poetic imagination to lift him to the bird, to transport him to the world of the bird. Tender is the night. It's rather early. The night has just begun. And happily the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry face. The queen is the queen moon. The moon is presented as a fairy queen, and she has ladies in waiting around her, and they are all the stars. The stars are the fairy attendants who wait on the queen. The queen, the moon, is the fairy queen, and her ladies in waiting, they're all fairies, are the stars. What a beautiful idea, how romantic. But here there is no light, because the speaker is now with the bird. The speaker has perched himself on the very branch on which the bird sits. Save, except what from heaven is with the breezes blown, through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. The leaves are thick, it's very thick, and there is no light. But when the wind blows, the breeze blows, I think I should say breeze, not wind, not wind. When the breeze blows, the leaves part, the branches part a little, and let in the light. It's quite dark because the nightingale and the speaker are now perched in the midst of a huge mass of branches and leaves, and there is no light there. But when the breezes blow, the leaves move, the branches part, and let in the light. Bacchus and his bards in the second line of the stanza, not charioted by Bacchus and his bards, Is there a hidden allusion to Titian's famous painting, Bacchus and Ariadne, in the line? Titian, of course, is the great Italian painter, the great Venetian painter. And Bacchus and Ariadne, oil on canvas, is one of his masterpieces. It hangs in the National Gallery in London, and it's quite probable that the poet had seen it. And it is quite probable that this line is inspired by the oil on canvas of Titian, Bacchus and Ariadne. But the chariot of Bacchus in the painting is drawn not by parts, not by leopards, but by cheetahs. And probably John Keats confused the cheetahs for leopards. Let me read to you the striking comment made by Harold Bloom on the Nightingale Ode. This is what Harold Bloom says, I quote, "The Ode to a Nightingale expresses a yearning to be transformed to a better and more blissful world." So this nightingale is a theological rather than an ornithological one. Unquote. I think that I said that the fourth stanza is extremely beautiful. Of course, I was right. I stand by it. But the fifth stanza is even better. It's simply exhilarating. It is one of the finest specimens of nature poetry in the English language. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. But in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows. The speaker is with the nightingale on the branch of the tree, and he is looking down. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet. You must remember that it is night. Tender is the night. That is what he says in the fourth stanza. The night has just begun. It is dark. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. There is very sweet smell all around. Incense. There is very sweet smell all around. But the speaker is unable to arrive at the specifics, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows. He cannot see, it is dark, he cannot confirm, but all that he can do is to guess each sweet wherewith the seasonable month endows. Embalm means preserve a dead body using spices. But now I think that spices are not used to embalm dead bodies. Injections are used. Preservatives are injected into the dead body. But in this poem, I don't think that the word embalmed is used in that sense. It's used instead in the archaic sense of give a fragrance to. Fill something with fragrance. That is the archaic meaning of the word, and it is in that sense that Keats uses it. Embalmed darkness, darkness which is heavily fragrant, darkness which is heavily filled with sweet smell. Seasonable can mean timely, seasonable can mean opportune. I think both the meanings are applicable here. It is May, and so it is timely. It is also opportune for the speaker from the point of view of the speaker. Endow here means provide. The seasonable month provides. What is the speaker trying to say? It is night, it is dark, he is on the branch of the tree along with the nightingale. He is not able to see anything, but the air is thick with fragrance, the night is embalmed, and even though he is unable to arrive at specifics, he can try to guess the source of each scent, the source of each fragrance. And it's a seasonable month, a month which endows or provides quite a few sources of fragrance. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows. The grass, the thicket, and the fruit tree wild, white hawthorn, and the pastoral eglantine, fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose, full of dewy wine, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. We often say that William Wordsworth is the nature poet of the English language, the nature poet in English literature. My question is, why don't we say that John Keats is also the nature poet of the English language, the nature poet in English literature? Look at this stanza where the magical beauty of the English countryside, the magical beauty of English nature is captured using a few brilliant strokes, a few deft strokes. The grass, the thicket, the fruit tree wild. Grass is, of course, vegetation which is not very tall. The leaves are narrow, and our lawns are made of grass, which are manicured, which are maintained. The grass, the thicket is trees growing close together, bushes growing close together in a dense formation. The grass, the thicket, the fruit tree wild. There's a tree which bears fruits, but the poet is unable to specify what tree it is. It's some wild fruit tree. Wild fruits grow on the tree. It's a wild fruit tree. White hawthorn. Hawthorn is a plant with thorns which is frequently used for creating hedges and which has white, pink or red flowers. But in this present case, the hawthorn, according to the speaker, has white flowers. Now you should not ask me how does the speaker know the flowers are white. The flowers could very well be pink or red, but perhaps The speaker is so familiar with the countryside, with the plants, with the flowers, with the hawthorn bush, that he knows the difference between the white hawthorn and the red hawthorn and the pink hawthorn by just smelling, by just inhaling the scent, by just inhaling the fragrance from a distance. Maybe the fragrance of the white hawthorn, the hawthorn bearing white flowers, is very different, or at least slightly different, from the hawthorn bearing red flowers or purple flowers. White hawthorn and pastoral eglantine. Eglantine is again a plant with thorns, with flowers which are frequently red or pink, and it's a plant which belongs to the rose family. Pastoral eglantine. Pastor, strictly speaking, means shepherd. We think a pastor is a Christian minister, a Protestant minister. But pastor means shepherd. Pastoral elegy. Pastoral here means beloved of shepherds. The eglantine, beloved of shepherds. Another name for eglantine is, of course, sweet briar. Fast fading violets covered up in leaves. The violet is a plant, small hardy plant. It's a perennial, native to Europe and Asia, which produces flowers which are purple blue. But the flowers typically do not last long. The lifespan of the violet flower is not particularly long, and that is why the speaker says fast fading violets covered up in leaves, and mid-May's eldest child. It is May, of course. This poem was written in May, and mid-May's eldest child, the first flower which appears in May, mid-May's eldest child, the coming musk rose. The musk rose is a kind of rose which is famous for its fragrance, for its musky fragrance. It's a Eurasian variety of rose. The coming musk rose, full of dewy wine. This could be a reference to the nectar, the sweet liquid that is secreted by the musk rose. Dew, of course, droplets of water created as a result of the condensation of atmospheric vapor, water vapor. The murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. The flies are haunting, the flies are flying in groups, and they are creating a murmuring sound as they fly. The murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. Summer evening, the tender is the night has just begun, and it can be disputed whether it is late in the evening or early in the night, and you find flies flying in groups, creating a murmuring sound. As I have already observed, John Keats deserves to be called a nature poet, and a great nature poet at that. In this stanza, he presents some of the most important and some of the most beautiful flowers of the English countryside and presents them in a very memorable manner. I would say that the flowers, that the flora, that the plants, that the trees are presented in a very romantic manner. It is highly romantic because the speaker is unable to see them. And it is only on the basis of fragrance, it's only on the basis of scent that the speaker is able to identify what most probably is beneath him, for he is sitting on the bough along with the nightingale. This is a very romantic way of presenting the most beautiful flowers of the English countryside. I would like to contrast this presentation with the presentation that we meet with in the opening stanza of an even more famous poem, Daffodils, of William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud. That's the first line of the poem, and that's sometimes used as the title of the poem. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Let us try to uncover the symbolism that is hidden in this stanza. The hawthorn symbolizes enchantment. The eglantine symbolizes pleasure and pain occurring simultaneously. The violet symbolizes love. The musk rose symbolizes magic. At this point in the discussion, I cannot but draw your attention to the observation of Middleton Murray on the Nightingale Ode. I quote, "For sheer loveliness, this poem is unsurpassed in the English language." Unquote. We now come to the extremely personal sixth stanza. Darkling I listen, and for many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Darkling I listen. I listen in the dark. Darkling means in the dark. You find it in Milton. You find it in Shakespeare. And for many a time, I have been half in love with easeful death. The speaker says that he was in love. Not exactly in love, but half in love. Partially in love with death. Not just any death, but easeful death, painless death, easy death. And maybe there is a secondary meaning. Death which brings ease, painlessness to the speaker. Death which is easy, painless, and also which puts an end to his life and thus brings ease, painlessness to the speaker. Call him soft names in many a mused rhyme. In his poetry, the speaker addresses death repeatedly, using sweet names. Call him soft names. The poet is half in love with death, and the poet behaves like a lover, addressing death using sweet names. In many a mused rhyme, of course it's poetry. Mused, how will you explain it? To muse means to think over something. Mused rhyme, poetry which is written as a result of musing, dreamily thinking over something. To take into the air my quiet breath. Not only did I address death using sweet names, I also requested death to put an end to my life, to take into the air my quiet breath. In real life, John Keats was a rather soft spoken person, and perhaps he has his own self image as a soft spoken man, and that is why he qualifies his breath as quiet breath, qualifies his breath with the epithet quiet, to take into the air my quiet breath. Perhaps I should pause here and attempt to work out a comparison as well as a contrast between the bird in this poem, between the nightingale in this poem, and the bird in the darkling thrush of Thomas Hardy. It is late in the evening. It is winter. The whole atmosphere is bleak. There is an air of melancholy. And in this atmosphere of melancholy, lifelessness, a thrush, which itself is aged, frail, gaunt, small, suddenly breaks into a full hearted, even song of joy. There are certainly points of comparison as well as points of contrast between the nightingale in the Nightingale Ode of Keats, John Keats, and the thrush in the darkling thrush of Thomas Hardy. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to seize upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. The speaker explains that he had always been in love, half in love with death. But now he seems to be fully in love. Now more than ever seems it rich to die. If he has to die, this is the moment for him to die. Now more than ever seems it rich to die. Rich means meaningful. Rich means, in this context, happy. In this context, the best opportunity, the best moment to die. There cannot be a happier, more painless, more easy, more meaningful death than the death that occurs now. To seize upon the midnight with no pain. He wants to die painlessly this midnight, to seize upon the midnight. To begin with, it was evening. He said, tender is the night. The night had just begun. Now he says, midnight. Time has elapsed. The night has progressed. It has become midnight. To seize upon the midnight with no pain. To die an easeful death, an easy death, a painless death this midnight, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. To die at this point of time, to die at this midnight, while the nightingale is singing in its full-throated ease, pouring forth its soul in extreme joy, in ecstasy, seems to be a very rich death. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. The poet dies, the speaker dies, listening to the bird. But the bird is unaware of this death, and the bird would continue to sing, even though the speaker no longer listens to the song. The bird would continue to sing. And that song would become, in effect, a high requiem. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain. The ears of the speaker are useless. They cannot hear any more because the speaker is dead. To thy high requiem. Requiem is the mass that is conducted for the repose of a soul in the Catholic Church. Now that the speaker is dead, the song of the bird becomes a requiem, a chant, a song, a mass which is sung for the repose of a departed soul, of a dead soul. To thy high requiem become a sword. Sword means the surface of the earth, especially the surface of the earth along with the grass on it. I think you can also call it turf. The speaker has died and he has become part of the earth. He has become a sword. His ears do not function. He cannot hear anymore. But the nightingale continues to sing its beautiful song, and the song becomes the requiem or the high mass conducted by the Catholic Church for the repose of his soul. Before I move to the penultimate stanza, I would like to observe that the Nightingale Ode was one of the favorite pieces of the poet himself. Arguably, the favorite poem of the poet himself. John Keats was fond of reciting the poem to his friends in his tremulous undertone, and his friends would be captivated by the richness of the poem as well as of the richness of the recitation. The penultimate stanza is a very important stanza because it embodies a crucial element in the thematic structure of the poem. Not just a crucial element, but also a controversial element. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. The poet apostrophizes the bird, calls it immortal bird, and declares that the nightingale was not born for death. Critics have had a problem with the opening line of the stanza. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. They ask, how can the nightingale be an immortal bird? And if the same parameters are used, human beings are also immortal. Just as the species of the nightingale lasts forever, the human species also lasts forever. Is it not a logical fallacy to call the bird, to call the nightingale immortal? I think that this controversy has arisen because of a basic misunderstanding of what the poet means. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. The nightingale is immortal because it is an element of nature, and Keats, as a nature poet, found immortality in nature. Well, if you say that the human species is immortal, It is fallacious because it is very unlike the species of the nightingale. The nightingale produces the same song, the same notes, generation after generation. The song of the nightingale that was heard 1,000 years back is heard now and will be heard 1,000 years from now. This is probably what Keats had in mind when he apostrophized the nightingale as immortal bird. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. The nightingale has no death because the song of the nightingale, the very song that is sung by the nightingale now, will always be sung by the nightingales to come. In this perspective, viewed in this perspective, the nightingale is immortal, unlike the human species. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The nightingale is far above the life, the miserable life that is led by human beings. No hungry generations tread thee down. In the human world, every generation is anxious to gain control over the material possessions that are under the control of the previous generation. Every generation is tread down by the coming generation in its anxiety to gain control over material possessions. There is no such competitive spirit in the world of the nightingales. There is no such anxiety for gaining control over material possessions in the world of the nightingale. The voice I heard this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Now it's clear. If the critics have a problem with the opening line of the poem, it is their problem. Because what is said in the first line is now amplified by the poet here. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Clown in the old sense of a rustic person, an unsophisticated person, a boor, a clumsy person coming from a village, not in the sense of buffoon. The very song that is heard by the poet now was heard in ancient times by everybody, by emperors and as well as by clowns. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path to the sad heart of Ruth when, sick for home, she stood in tears amid the alien corn. The reference here is to the book of Ruth in the Old Testament. Ruth was a Moabite woman, in fact, a Moabite widow who follows her mother-in-law, Naomi, to Bethlehem, accepts Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. In Bethlehem, the land of the Israelites, she is compelled, she is forced to glean corn in the fields in order to support herself. She is overcome by a wave of nostalgia, a wave of homesickness, as she stands in the fields gleaning corn. And at that moment, she is distracted by the song of a nightingale, the same that oft times hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairly lands forlorn. These lines powerfully capture the quintessence of medieval chivalry and romance. We get the, the tantalizing picture of a castle on an island in the middle of a dangerous sea, and of a girl, probably a princess, imprisoned in the castle. She is sad, sorrowful, heartbroken. But when she hears the song of the nightingale, she suddenly opens the casements, the windows of the castle, in order to listen to the song of the nightingale better. The idea that nature is permanent, everlasting, eternal, while human beings are ephemeral, transient, temporary, found in this stanza, embedded in this stanza, is echoed in the poem The Brook of Alfred Lord Tennyson. This is what the Brook of Tennyson says. I quote, "For men may come and men may go, but I go on forever." Unquote. A striking feature of the Nightingale Ode is its golden fluidity. Nowhere is it more visible than at the point in its thematic trajectory, when the poem moves from stanza 7 to stanza 8. Look at the last word of the penultimate stanza, the last word, the last line of the penultimate stanza. Forlorn. This exactly is the first word of the first line of the last stanza. Forlorn. Forlorn means sad, sorrowful, hopeless, desolate. In the seventh stanza, the speaker mentions perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. Here, forlorn means desolate, isolated, cut off from the rest of the world. But the word forlorn acts as a bell. It is as if a bell has been rung. Forlorn, the very word, is like a bell. To toll me back from thee to my soul self. It acts as a bell. The ringing of the bell, it is as if a bell has been rung. The word forlorn acts as the ringing of a bell, and the ringing of the bell shatters the charm, breaks the spell, destroys the magic, and the speaker returns from the nightingale to his own self. And then he explains, "Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. Adieu, the fancy cannot cheat so well as she's famed to do, deceiving elf." Elf is a mythological creature, is a mischievous creature in folk mythology. The elf enjoys deceiving people. The speaker calls fancy or imagination deceiving elf. There is no doubt that the imagination is capable of deceiving people, but there is a point beyond which it cannot go. The fancy, the imagination cannot cheat people as much as it is known to do, so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. There is no doubt that the fancy or the imagination is a deceiving elf, and the fancy or the imagination is capable of deceiving people. To deceive means to make someone believe something to be true when it is actually false. But beyond the point, the fancy cannot go. The fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades. Your sad song becomes weaker and weaker. The bird is flying away. The nightingale is flying away. And It is as if the speaker is able to trace the path taken by the bird in its flight. Adieu, adieu, thy plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows. Meadows are grasslands. Over the still stream. Stream is a small river, a narrow river, and the water here doesn't seem to flow forcefully, and that's why the speaker calls it the still stream. Up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. A glade is a clearing in the middle of a forest. A glade is open space in the middle of woodland. Here, the speaker finds the song of the bird, the sorrowful song of the bird, the sad song of the bird, growing weaker and weaker as the bird flies away. And the speaker, on the basis of the song, is able to trace the trajectory of the flight of the bird, and he realizes that the nightingale, flies past the near meadows, over the still stream, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? The last two lines, they are very significant. The last two lines forcefully and decisively effect a shift from the nightingale and its song to the speaker himself. Was it a vision? The past tense is used. Was it a vision? The nightingale is no longer there. The song is no longer heard. Was it a vision or a waking dream? Something mystical about it, something magical about it. Was it a dream seen when the speaker was awake, a waking dream? Or was it a vision? Was it a supernatural vision? Was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. The music is gone. The music is no longer there. Do I wake or sleep? The speaker returns forcefully, decisively to himself, but he is unsure of the state in which he finds himself. Do I wake or sleep? Am I awake or am I asleep? So powerful, so overwhelming, so spectacular has been the impact of the song of the nightingale on the speaker that the speaker is not able to clarify the state in which he finds himself. Do I wake or sleep? The Nightingale Ode comprises 8 stanzas, but innumerable thematic strands, or with some exaggeration, one can say that innumerable thematic strands are woven into the fabric of the poem. The poet reveals his own pathetic, sorrowful existence, shares his own heartbreak with his readers. The poet mentions the use of alcohol, mentions the use of narcotics and alcohol. And it would appear that the poet sees the use of narcotics and alcohol as a solution to the problems of human existence. The poet throws light on the pathetic condition of the human being, how human life is full of misery, how in the human world, where but to think is to be full of sorrow. The poet highlights the power of poesy, the power of poetic imagination, how Poetic imagination is capable of overriding all obstacles and reaching the goal it desires to attain. The poet gives us a tantalizing glimpse of English nature, a tantalizing glimpse of the beauties of English nature. The poet tries to work out an equation between life and death and reveals that he has always been in love, or at least half in love with death, which is not painful, half in love with easeful death. The poet works out a contrast between the immortality of the bird and the mortality of the human being. How the nightingale is far above the material concerns of the human being, and how the nightingale is immortal, its song is eternal, it is permanent, while the human being is temporary, transient. The thematic fabric of the poem is beautifully and complexly interwoven. The Nightingale Ode deals with the past and the present, life and death, joy and sorrow, vision and dream, sleep and waking, narcotics and alcohol, mortality and immortality. We often call William Wordsworth the nature poet of the English language, but poems like the Nightingale Ode convince us that William Wordsworth will have to share that position with John Keats. Reading the Nightingale Ode, one gets the impression that John Keats is a gifted nature poet, at least as gifted as William Wordsworth was. We get brilliant pictures of the moon and the stars. The moon is presented as a fairy queen and the stars as her ladies in waiting. We meet with some of the most beautiful flowers of the English countryside: hawthorn, eglantine, violet, musk rose. The poet also speaks of the grass, the thicket, the fruit tree wild. We are told of the haunt of flies on summer eves, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. The nature of England is described in accurate detail and with passionate sensitivity in the Nightingale Ode. I would even postulate that the knowledge of John Keats of nature, of the English countryside, was deeper, more profound, and more accurate than the knowledge of William Wordsworth. There is no doubt that John Keats is one of the finest nature poets of the English language. In the Nightingale Ode, the poet paints the human condition in very poor light. It would appear that the poet seems to believe that to be human is to suffer. Human life is presented as a pathetic saga, as a drama of misery, as a narrative of heartbreak. Human life is feverish, full of worry and exhaustion. The poet alludes to disease, old age, love failure. All that you can hear is the groaning of human beings. A groaning human being listens to the groaning of other human beings. The world is such a place that where but to think is to be full of sorrow. If you make an attempt to think, You are only inviting sorrow. The picture that we get from the Nightingale Ode of the human condition is extremely frightening. Life, human life, according to the poet, is full of misery, despair, sorrow, sadness, heartbreak. One should try to understand the reasons why the poet paints such a dark picture of the human condition. John Keats lost his parents very early. He led a life of poverty. His own brother Tom died of consumption, and he too would die of consumption one day. Recent biographers have tried to establish that the mother of the poet had an alcohol problem, and it would appear that the poet himself had an alcohol problem. It may be pointed out that the human condition, which is painted in such frighteningly dark colors in the Nightingale Ode, only serves to highlight the song of the nightingale, serves to heighten the value of the song of the nightingale, serves to establish a powerful and memorable contrast between the human condition and the nightingale, its song, and its world. If you utter the name John Keats to a schoolboy and ask him to utter a word in response to that name, he is most likely to come up with the word sensuousness. So close is the bond between John Keats and sensuousness. So close is the relationship. The name John Keats and the concept sensuousness go hand in hand even in the imagination of a schoolboy. Sensuousness is appeal to the senses. Poetry can appeal to the mind, to the intellect, to the soul. The poetry of John Keats, while appealing to all these to some extent, or at least to a small extent, very much appeal to the senses. The senses of the reader, the sense of touch, the sense of smell, the sense of hearing, the sense of sight, are all overwhelmed by the poetry of John Keats. They are completely conquered by the poetry of John Keats. And a very fine example of the sensuousness of John Keats, where the poetry, while appealing to the mind, while appealing to the heart, while appealing to a small extent to the intellect, while appealing to a small extent to the soul, very much appeals to the senses of the reader. And a very fine example of this is, of course, the Nightingale Ode. In the very first stanza, the appeal is to the sense of sight. In some melodious plot, sense of hearing, of beechen green and shadows numberless, that is sense of sight. Singest of summer in full-throated ease, that is sense of hearing. Oh, for a draught of vintage, that stanza very much the sense of taste. Tasting of flora and the country green. Dance and Provençal song. Dance and Provençal song appeal to the sense of sight and the sense of hearing. Stanza 5 very much appeals to the sense of smell. The poet is not able to see anything because it's quite dark, and perhaps also he is in a mental state of not being able to see. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, but he can smell the soft incense, the embalmed darkness, the darkness which is fragrant, and he is able to guess from the smell, from the scent, from the fragrance, the flowers that are there. At the end of the stanza, there is an appeal to the sense of hearing, the murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. In the sixth stanza, it's largely the sense of hearing, as the bird pours forth its soul in ecstasy. In the seventh stanza, in the penultimate stanza, it's again largely the sense of hearing. The song being heard by emperor and clown, the song being heard by Ruth. But towards the end of the seventh stanza, in the penultimate line, if I'm not wrong, the poet speaks of magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas. One can almost touch the foam. One can almost touch the foam, the sense of touch. And in the last stanza, again, it's the sense of hearing. As the plaintive anthem fades past the near meadows, over the still streams, up the hillside, and now 'tis buried deep in the next valley glades. In the context of this discussion, I would like to quote Matthew Arnold, who said, Keats as a poet is abundantly and enchantingly sensuous. Unquote. Escapism is the tendency to avoid reality. It is the tendency to retreat from a reality which is too harsh or too dangerous or too unpleasant to the person. This tendency usually finds expression through exercises of the imagination or processes in real life. The person might engage in an exercise of the imagination or in an activity which helps him to avoid reality for the time being. Escapism is an important element in Romanticism. Certainly an important element in John Keats, and most certainly an important element in the Nightingale Ode. In fact, the Nightingale Ode can be seen as an exercise, a brilliant exercise in escapism. How does the poem begin? My heart aches. The speaker suffers from heartbreak, sorrow, misery, failure, love failure, and he finds the world inhabited by him to be a very unpleasant and unacceptable world. It's a world where youth disappears in no time. It is a world where love does not last. It is a world where beauty turns into ugliness. And the process of beauty turning into ugliness does not require much time. From such a world which is completely unacceptable to the speaker flies to the nightingale, goes to the world of the nightingale, first by using alcohol and then by using his poetic imagination. What is this but escapism in its purest form? And the world of the nightingale, which the speaker comes to inhabit for a brief while, is beautiful, magical, lovely, and it overwhelms his senses. But an important lesson that is taught by the poem is that escapism is not a permanent solution. By the time we reach the last stanza of the poem, the speaker realizes that the fancy cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. That even if you have a powerful imagination, even if you have a gifted imagination, the imagination cannot help you to escape from reality for too long a time. And the poet returns to the real world, the world from which he had departed in order to enter the world of the nightingale, and realizes that escapism provides no permanent solution. I would like to make an attempt to connect the escapism that we are now talking of with the famous sensuousness that is the hallmark, or that is one of the hallmarks of the poetry of John Keats. In the Nightingale Ode itself, the poet admits that thought is painful to him. To think is to be full of sorrow. I think it's in stanza 3. Where but to think is to be full of sorrow. This life being what it is, if you attempt to think, you only bring sorrow upon yourself. On the other hand, sensations give one delight, pleasure, joy. And hence, Keats tried to avoid thought and instead attempted to submit himself to sensations. There is the famous exclamation in one of his letters, "Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts. Oh, for a life of sensations rather than of thoughts." Thus, there is an integral connection, an intrinsic connection between the escapism that we meet with in his poetry and the sensuousness that his poetry is famous for. One last point. I think there's a lot in common, a tremendous commonality between the speaker in the Nightingale Ode and John Keats in real life. And one point that they have in common is that in real life, as much as the speaker in the poem, in real life, John Keats experimented not just with alcohol, but also with, if we are to believe some of his recent biographers, but also with narcotics. In literature, medievalism is the tendency to seek inspiration from the Middle Ages. In the history of Europe, we can say that the Middle Ages lasted from the 5th century approximately, maybe the late 5th century, up to the 15th century, the late 15th century. That is from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance. John Keats was a great fan of the Middle Ages, and his poetry is studded with gems of medievalism. Medievalism gems are studded throughout his poetry, and the Nightingale Ode is no exception. In fact, we find an effort in the Nightingale Ode to capture effectively the quintessence of medievalism, the quintessence of the Middle Ages, as Keats saw the Middle Ages in the poem. Kindly focus attention on the last 3 lines of the penultimate stanza of the ode. The same that oft times hath charmed magic casements opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. The lines evoke a tantalizing picture of an isolated castle in a remote island in the middle of the sea, and of a girl, probably a beautiful princess, imprisoned in the castle. And the casements, the windows of the castle, are always closed, but the voice of the nightingale is capable of charming the magic casements, of throwing open the windows of the castle as the imprisoned princess wants to hear the voice of the nightingale better. With a few deft strokes, the poet has evoked a picture of the Middle Ages, a romanticized picture of the Middle Ages with all its glory. I think that these lines invite comparison with the casement stanza of the Eve of St. Agnes. In the Eve of St. Agnes, an entire stanza is devoted to providing a detailed description of a casement in the castle. And these lines about the magic casements here can be profitably compared and contrasted with the casement stanza of the Eve of St. Agnes. In literature, Hellenism is an attempt to draw inspiration from the civilization, the culture, the mythology of ancient Greece. John Keats was an ardent worshipper of ancient Greek civilization, culture, and mythology, and this is visible in much of his poetry, including the Nightingale Ode. The very opening of the Nightingale Ode is studded with a brilliant exemplification of the Hellenism of John Keats. However, this is an indirect reference, this is an allusion, rather oblique allusion. The word hemlock is a poison, but in small quantities, hemlock can be effective as a sedative. The speaker in the Nightingale Ode starts by saying that his heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains his sense as though he has drunk hemlock. Even a schoolboy would immediately be reminded of Socrates when he hears the word hemlock. There is no doubt that the most illustrious man, the most famous man to drink hemlock in the history of the Western world is Socrates. Thus, the Nightingale Ode opens with an oblique allusion to a very significant event in ancient Greek history. In the first stanza itself, the poet speaks of Lethe and Dryad. Lethe was the river of forgetfulness in the Greek underworld. Dryad was a tree spirit. It often took the shape of a beautiful woman. Thus, the poem opens with a strong note of Hellenism. In the second stanza, we have Flora and Hippocrene. Flora is more a Roman goddess than a Greek goddess, but her origins lie in ancient Greece. She was the goddess of flowers in particular and of vegetation in general. Hippocrene is the fountain on Mount Helicon, created by the hooves of Pegasus, and the fountain was sacred to the Muses, and its waters symbolized or even gave poetic inspiration. In stanza 4, we have Bacchus and his parts. Bacchus was the Roman god of wine, celebration, religious ecstasy, theatre. The Greeks called him Dionysus. Bacchus travelled in a chariot drawn by leopards. Perhaps I should have said it first of all. The ode is a literary form which has its roots in ancient Greek literature. It was pioneered by Pindar, and so you have the Pindaric ode as well as the Horatian ode. The very selection of the ode form by the poet is an important exemplification of Hellenism, an important Greek myth that is interwoven subtly into the fabric of the Nightingale Ode is the story of Philomela. Philomela is raped by her brother-in-law, sister's husband, Tereus, and mutilated by him. She becomes a nightingale and spends her life singing her beautiful song. I would like to pause for a moment and effect a minor correction. I think early in the discussion I said that the Nightingale Ode was written in the summer of 1819. The poem was written in May 1819. And strictly speaking, in England, in the UK, May is a spring month. Spring comes to an end in May, and summer starts after that. Summer starts only in June. So I think I should have said, to be very accurate, that John Keats wrote the Nightingale Ode in the spring of 1819. However, the internal evidence suggests summer rather more than spring. For example, the poet speaks of the murmur of flies on summer eves. The ode has its roots in ancient Greek literature. The ode is usually a short poem, lyrical in nature, expressing the thoughts and feelings of the poet about something or somebody, and usually addressed to that something or somebody. I think that the Nightingale Ode shares all these characteristics. It is rather short, it's lyrical, it expresses the thoughts and feelings of the poet about the nightingale, it is addressed to the nightingale, the language is elevated throughout. Odes can be Pindaric, Horatian, or irregular. Ode to a Nightingale can be seen as a Horatian ode. This is because it has a regular rhyme scheme, a regular stanzaic pattern, and a regular meter. The themes dealt with in the Nightingale Ode are also quite Horatian. The Horatian ode usually is an attempt to celebrate and praise, and that precisely is what the poet does in the Nightingale Ode. He celebrates and praises the nightingale and its song. Also, the Horatian ode is more intimate than the Pindaric ode. In the Nightingale Ode, the speaker bares his soul to the reader. The speaker reveals extremely personal and intimate experiences to the reader. The Nightingale Ode is organized in 8 stanzas of 10 lines each, and the stanzaic pattern and the linear length are more or less uniform. As has already been said, the poem comprises 8 stanzas of 10 lines each. Thus, the poem consists of 80 lines. The meter used is iambic pentameter. Penta means 5. Iambic pentameter means there are 5 feet in each line. And each foot is an iamb. Each foot consists of 2 syllables. An unaccented syllable followed by an accented syllable. There is an exception in each stanza to this rule, and that is the 8th line. The 8th line is iambic trimeter, which means there are only 3 feet in that line. The rhyme scheme followed is A B A B C D E C D E. The imagery that we meet with in the Nightingale Ode is absolutely stunning. We have classical imagery, nature imagery, seasonal imagery, images of the French summer, of the English spring, images from human life, images of death, images of disease, biblical imagery, medieval imagery, images of the human body, and of course, ornithological imagery. In fact, a wide variety of striking images can be found in the poem. The Nightingale in the Nightingale Ode is certainly a bird, but it is also a symbol, and a very profound and powerful symbol at that. First of all, the nightingale symbolizes nature. The bird that the speaker listens to, and the bird which throws such a hypnotic effect on the speaker through its song, is very much part of the English countryside. The bird is part of nature, and it symbolizes nature. It represents the eternity of nature, the immortality of nature. Like everything else in nature, it is eternal, everlasting, immortal. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. And in this, the nightingale, which symbolizes nature, offers a sharp contrast to human existence, which is temporary, transient, and momentary. Secondly, the nightingale in the Nightingale Ode can symbolize a higher plane of existence. This higher plane of existence is far above the plane of existence of the speaker. It is significant that the speaker has to fly up to the branch of the tree where the bird is perched in order to reach this plane of existence. Thirdly, and most importantly, the nightingale in the Nightingale Ode can symbolize a world which is literally worlds away from the world of the speaker. The world of the speaker is the world of the human being, which is full of sorrow, where but to think is to be full of sorrow. The world of the human being, the world of the speaker, which is the world of the human being, is filled with misery, disease, death, dejection, despair. But the world of the nightingale is full of beauty and joy. This is a world which, as I said, is worlds away from the world of the human being. And the way to reach this world, the way to leave the world of the human being and to reach this world, the world of the nightingale, is through alcohol, narcotics, or poetic imagination, or literature. So we have three ways in which we can reach this marvelous world, which is nothing short of paradise: alcohol, narcotics, and literature. Every schoolboy knows that the Nightingale Ode is a feast to the senses of the reader. One of the most important of these senses is the sense of sight, and the Nightingale Ode offers the reader a number of brilliant and detailed word pictures. For example, in the second stanza, we see dancing, singing, merrymaking in sunny southern France, in the sunny southern France region, sunny region of southern France called Provence. In the same stanza, we see beaded bubbles winking at the brim and purple stained mouth. A very picturesque description of bubbles forming at the mouth of the beaker full of wine. In the third stanza, we get a picture of a scene in an hospital where patients of consumption, as it was called, are being treated. In a tuberculosis hospital where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs. In the fourth stanza, we get a memorable picture of the classical god Bacchus in his chariot drawn by leopards, by pards. We almost see Titian's masterpiece, Bacchus and Ariadne, in front of us. And this great painting, one of the most famous paintings of Titian, now hangs in the National Gallery in London. In the penultimate stanza, we get a heartrending picture of Ruth, of biblical fame, standing in an alien land, gleaning corn, picking up corn in order to support herself and her mother-in-law. Thus, the Nightingale Ode is remarkable for its fantastic pictures, for its brilliant picturesqueness. John Keats was a genius when it came to using figures of speech. One of the reasons the Nightingale Ode attains the stunning success it does is the marvelous ability of the poet to manipulate figures of speech. One of them is onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia or echoism is the figure of speech in which the sound echoes the sense, or the sound gives a sense of the sense. By just listening to the sound, without even understanding the meaning of the words, one comes to understand, at least to some extent, what the line conveys. An example of onomatopoeia in the Nightingale Ode is the last line, the 10th line of the 5th stanza. The murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. The murmurous haunt of flies on summer eves. When you listen to the line, you can almost hear the flies murmuring in the summer evenings. Hyperbole is the figure of speech in which the writer makes an exaggerated statement. It is an overstatement. It is made in order to create a specific impact. We meet with hyperbole in the seventh stanza, in the opening line of the penultimate stanza. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. Simile is the figure of speech in which the writer establishes an explicit comparison between two things. The comparison is not subtly suggested, but forcefully stated. In the present poem, John Keats uses a very powerful simile right at the beginning of the poem. In the opening stanza, I think it is in line 2 and line 3, the poet compares his state. The poet compares the state of his mind and the state of his body to the state of himself having taken poison, hemlock, or having taken a sedative, hemlock in small quantities, that is what is meant, or having taken some narcotic, opiate. Similarly, towards the end of the poem, in the opening line of the last stanza of the poem, the eighth stanza of the poem, the poet declares that the word forlorn is like a bell. The word forlorn to him is like a bell. Metaphor is the figure of speech in which the comparison between two things is not explicitly stated but implicitly established. The poet makes use of several extremely appropriate metaphors in the present poem. For example, in the second stanza, oh, for a beaker full of the warm south. The south, or the southern part of France, is metaphorized here as a beaker of wine emanating from the southern part of France, from Provence, as we learn a little later. Similarly, in the third last stanza, I think it's the sixth stanza, the last line, the song of the nightingale is metaphorized as a requiem. A requiem is the mass, the Catholic mass that is conducted for the repose of a departed soul. To thy high requiem become a sword. Alliteration is the figure of speech in which consonant sounds are repeated in succession. John Keats makes use of alliteration with tremendous effect in the poem under consideration. For example, in the opening stanza, we come across the line, that thou light-winged dryad of the trees. That thou light-winged dryad of the trees. Another example would be the opening line of the third stanza. Fade far away, dissolve and quite forget. I repeat, fade far away, dissolve and quite forget. Assonance is the figure of speech in which vowel sounds are repeated in succession. Keats thus makes use of assonance with appropriate effect in the poem under consideration. For example, in the opening stanza he says, in some melodious plot. in some melodious plot. We meet with assonance in the opening lines of the last stanza. Forlorn, the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee to my soul self. Enjambment is the flow of meaning and momentum beyond the end of a line, beyond the end of a couplet, or beyond the end of a stanza. In the Nightingale Ode, John Keats repeatedly uses enjambment, as exemplified by the very opening lines of the poem. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense. Or look at the opening lines of the second stanza. Oh, for a draught of vintage that had been cooled a long age, that had been cooled a long age. Apostrophe is the figure of speech in which the speaker suddenly turns to address somebody or something. An ode is a poem which is addressed to somebody or something. The whole of the Nightingale Ode is addressed to the nightingale. So we cannot say that the speaker suddenly turns to address the nightingale, because he has been addressing the nightingale all along. Still, the powerful exclamatory statement at the opening of the penultimate stanza, thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, can be seen as an apostrophe. The speaker looks at the bird and apostrophizes the bird. Personification is the figure of speech in which human characteristics, human appearance, human agency, human form is given to non-human things. We meet with personification more than once in the Nightingale Ode. For example, in stanza 3, the poet says, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes. Where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes. An excellent exemplification of the figure of speech of personification. In the next stanza, stanza 4, the poet says, and haply the queen moon is on her throne. And haply the queen moon is on her throne. This is another example of the appropriate use of the figure of speech of personification. Anaphora is the figure of speech in which your word is repeated in successive lines, especially in the initial position. We meet with a striking use of the figure of speech of anaphora in the third stanza of the Nightingale Ode. Let me try to remember the lines. I quote, where palsy shakes a few sad last grey hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow, and let an eye despairs, where beauty cannot keep her lustrous eyes. Unquote. Caesura is in some ways the opposite of enjambment. Caesura is a pause, positioned somewhere near the middle of a line. John Keats uses caesura more than once in the Nightingale Ode. For example, we find it in stanza 4. I think it's line 5. Already with thee tender is the night. Already with thee tender is the night. Line 5 of stanza 4. Another example is the very last line of the poem, the 10th line of the 8th stanza of the poem. Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep? Fled is that music, do I wake or sleep? I have indeed been speaking for quite some time on this poem, and I think I've spoken quite comprehensively on the Nightingale Ode. But the problem with a poem like the Nightingale Ode is that however much you speak on it, there always remains something more to say. So I shall wrap up this discussion on a very personal note. I fell under the spell of the Nightingale Ode as a lad of 12, as a schoolboy of 12. I memorized the poem completely, and I would recite the poem to myself and then find myself in tears. I continue to be under the spell of the poem. I have always believed that the Nightingale Ode is the most personal, the most emotional, the most rich, the most melancholy, the most beautiful of all the great odes of John Keats.